Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Today, President Obama spoke at the annual convention of the National Action Network, a group founded by my colleague, the Reverend Al Sharpton. And for the second day in a row, the president was giving a speech on civil rights at a moment in his presidency when the discussion of race in the Obama era has reached an intense crescendo. And if yesterday the president was solemn and diplomatic at the LBJ Memorial Library in Texas, today he was frank and clear and pointed as he took aim at one of the most disturbing political and racial trends of his tenure, the full frontal assault on a citizen's franchise, the right to vote.
Across the country, Republicans have led efforts to pass laws making it harder, not easier, for people to vote. The real voter fraud is people who try to deny our rights by making bogus arguments about voter fraud. America did not stand up and did not march and did not sacrifice to gain the right to vote for themselves and for others, only to see it denied to their kids and their grandchildren. We've got to pay attention to this. This recent effort to restrict the vote has not been led by both parties. It's been led by the Republican Party. If your strategy depends on having fewer people show up to vote, that's not a sign of strength. That's a sign of weakness.
A rare moment of partisan clarity from the president, one backed up squarely by the record. First, let's recall, 5 Republican-appointed justices on the Supreme Court gutted a key part of the Voting Rights Act. Shortly thereafter, 7 states that had been covered in whole or in part by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, 7 states that also had, we should add, Republican governors and or legislatures move forward with restrictive voting measures. And this is not some accident. If that map is the crime scene, with the victim being American democracy, what, you might ask, is the motive? A fascinating new study leads us towards that motive. 2 Northwestern University psychologists surveyed white respondents nationwide, and they asked them something. They asked these folks about the racial shift in California, if they had heard that the state of California had become majority-minority. In other words, that whites were becoming the minority in that state. And what they found was, after learning of this fact, the respondents exhibited a significant shift toward Republican identification. In the second experiment, they focused on the overall U.S. shift. Again, they found that white Americans became more conservative and more likely to endorse conservative policies when they were aware of demographic changes that will eventually displace them from the country's majority. In other words, when you tell white voters they are going to be the minority, they get more conservative. Presumably, this is because they find themselves staring down the barrel into a future they fear, a future in which they could possibly end up on the wrong side of the social hierarchy. The study found that this rightward shift was true of respondents who were politically unaffiliated as well as those affiliated with either political party. Crucially, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, it didn't matter. They all tended to, quote, endorse conservative policy positions more strongly. Now, this fear-based shift isn't simply academic. You see it being actively discussed and promoted by those who are seeking to make white people fear their future. Here's Bill O'Reilly on election night 2012, when it was becoming apparent that President Obama would win a second term.
The demographics are changing. It's not a traditional America anymore. And there are 50% of the voting public who want stuff. They want things. And whereby 20 years ago, President Obama would have been roundly defeated by an establishment candidate like Mitt Romney. The white establishment is now the minority.
Whether conscious or not, whether intentional or not, if the stakes that people understand for their politics are some kind of future of permanent dispossession, well, then it becomes a war of any means necessary to preserve the current order, to preserve one's edge. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to simply make sure that those other folks, the ones who aren't part of the, white establishment, the ones who want things, that those folks can't vote. Joining me now, Reverend Al Sharpton, founder and president of the National Action Network and host of Politics Nation on MSNBC. I was struck today by the difference in the president's tone yesterday. It's similar, in some senses, similar thematic elements to the speeches. He's talking about the struggle for civil rights in both places. And the difference between the president's tone yesterday and his tone today in front of your group, the National Action Network, he seemed much more pointed, less diplomatic, less solemn, more more kind of specific about calling out what the problem is.
Well, I think yesterday they were commemorating the 50th anniversary of what Lyndon Johnson had done in the Civil Rights Act. Today was about Action Today. And that's what he referred to, National Action Network, the name of the organization, and what we're trying to do. So I think yesterday was talking about civil rights in the 60s and 50-year anniversary. Today was talking about civil rights today, and he outlined that voting rights and voting suppression is a very serious civil rights issue of today.
When a white Republican conservative clicks on the television today and he sees Barack Obama is speaking at the National Action Network, Al Sharpton's group, what do you want to say to that guy whose brain might be going through precisely the process that we're talking about this experiment, right? Which is this idea that, oh, this isn't going to be, quote, my country anymore.
Well, I think that what he has to say is, why would you not think it's not going to be your country when you've not been denied anything?
Right.
People that National Action Network has represented is people who have been denied use in this country. So it seems kind of strange to me that people were never denied equal rights, never denied public accommodations, would wonder if they're going to lose the country because people that were denied that now are just getting equal rights and fighting to maintain it.
But that, I completely agree. It's not rational, but I think that fear exists. I mean, that fear, I think, is projected outwards. I think part of the backlash politics you see in the Obama era, part of what you're seeing on the voting rights front, is to kind of preserve this order.
But I think it's failing because they used it in 12. And we all organized, mobilized, and people came out and voted, and the president won the election.
Right.
And I think that as we continue to go forward and not play into people's fears, but play into people's reality and the common good of the country, that those that do have that apprehension are in the minority, and they will continue to dwindle in numbers.
There's two elements to sort of electoral exercise of the franchise, and one of them is being able to vote, and then there's people actually coming out to vote. Right. Those two things have to go together, and we've seen a real division between what that looks like in presidential years and in midterms so far in 2010. What's your sense of what kind of turnout we're going to see in 2014, and how you kind of recreate the sort of 2012 turnout in and off year?
I think that one of the things that we're going to be challenged with, groups like National Action Network and NAACP and others, is to get the real urgency out, like we did in 2012, that will bring that vote out. Now, you had a lot of work that was on the ground that mobilized a lot of that vote because people felt their rights were violated. You've got to do that again. Now, what you don't have is President Obama on the ballot. So that means we're going to have to dig in deeper, organize harder, which I think is why it was important that National Action Network convention this week, which doesn't end until tomorrow, heard from the Attorney General, heard from the President, so they will understand how serious this is. And the President went all in, to use your term today, to explain how important it is by coming himself and really laying out this case.
You said before that you think the effort is failing, and I would agree in terms of what we've seen electorally, but at another level you could say if you look at the Supreme Court's decision, if you look at those states that are moving ahead with things that had been blocked by the pre-clearance aspect of the Voting Rights Act, if you look at how successful they've been in implementing these, they are moving forward aggressively with the efforts to make voting harder.
Right, I think they are. But I think that we've just got to fight harder. And I think that we showed in 12, and the president said today, if you, one, have to fight the new impediments, the voter ID, the ending early voting days or cutting back on them, ending Sunday going to vote. At the same time, though, we have to have a mobilization to no matter what impediments they put there, we're going to vote anyhow if we have to stand in lines and all. So you have to have a two-pronged strategy, and that's what we're mobilizing in the
And I would add a third prong, which is proactively making it easier to vote. Having election days on Sundays, for instance.
Absolutely.
You know, it struck me when they had the ridiculous fake referendum in Crimea to join Russia.
Right.
Even there, in a fake election, they had the election on a weekend. And, so people didn't have to take off of work.
People for photo
That's
ID.
right. That's right. Reverend Al Sharpton, always a pleasure.
All right, good to see you, Chris.
All right, you can catch Rev Al's show at 6 p.m. Eastern, weeknights right here on MSNBC. Joining me now is civil rights attorney Judith Browne Dianis. She's co-director of the Advancement Project. So what does the landscape look like legally right now in terms of the fallout legally, not legislatively, legally with the Voting Rights Act, the core part of it, the pre-clearance part being gutted, the states moving ahead? What recourse is there now in the courts to fight back?
Right. Well, thanks for having me, Chris. I mean, so right now with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court, what we're finding is groups like Advancement Project and others having to go in and aggressively litigate. So, for example, we have a case in North Carolina against what's called the monster voter suppression bill that has everything in there. It's the kitchen sink. But you also see in Texas very quickly, I mean, we must remember, after the Shelby County case, Texas tweeted out that they were going to implement voter ID right after that decision. North Carolina waited till that decision to pass that monster bill. Virginia never sent in their voter ID bill to the Department of Justice because they, too, wanted to wait for the Supreme Court to gut it. And so we see states continuing to move in this direction. And for us, you know, it just means more litigation. And thank goodness we have a great attorney general and an Obama administration that is aggressively litigating alongside with us.
Is the Supreme Court's current holdings on voter ID, are they wrong? I mean, even before, if I'm not mistaken, I guess it was it in the Roberts Court that the Crawford decision, which upheld the Indiana voter ID.
That's right.
And even the great liberal hero John Paul Stevens on the, I think, wrong side of that issue. Is the court's current jurisprudence on the constitutionality of some of these means, is it just flat out wrong?
Well, you know, too bad I'm not on the Supreme Court, Chris, because we might have had some different decisions. Yes, I mean, they're wrong. And in fact, you know, we have now seen Judge Posner come back and say, maybe I was wrong in that case. But the other piece is that when you look at the Pennsylvania voter ID case, which Advancement Project and ACLU brought in state court, there's a really great language about how the Constitution has a right to vote. And even though that was state law, it should apply in federal instances too, that our right to vote should not be impeded by these barriers and fake barriers, because in fact in Pennsylvania and in other states we've pointed out that in fact there is no voter fraud and that instead this really is about manipulation of the vote in order to control outcomes.
There's the conservatives that I read when they're writing about this. There's some who I think are I just can't take seriously as good faith because they're talking about voter fraud and all this nonsense. But if you put that aside, there's a certain line of conservatives who say, yeah, we shouldn't be pushing for this voter ID stuff. It's probably alienating. It's not that important. But what the left is doing with it is equally ridiculous. They're blowing this out of proportion. You're talking about a few 100,000 people here at the margins, and this is basically being used to gin up the base. What do you say to that?
Well, you know, unfortunately, there are millions of people that don't have the very strict voter ID that these states are requiring. And, you know, when you think about the number of people who can't vote in early voting because they're cutting back early voting, in a place like Manatee County, Florida, after Section 5 was gutted, Manatee County decided to get rid of a third of its voting sites, which were disproportionately in black communities. So we have to look not just what's happening at the state level, but it's at the very local level where election officials can engage in all kinds of shenanigans to actually change the outcomes of elections.
Yeah, people think Washington is nasty or broken or dysfunctional. You should go check out some local politics.
That's right.
Things can get really gnarly down there. Judith Browne Dianis from the Advancement Project.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Chris.
Coming up, the city of Mena, Arkansas. Motto is where good things happen. And something good did happen there this week because, it appears, of Obamacare. It's the strongest anecdotal example I have heard yet that the law is doing precisely what it should be doing. I'm going to explain ahead.